So we're going back on stage again. We're going to be live in the Cork Opera House on March 30th for a very special event, which is going to form part of the Cork Podcast Festival. Our show is called Look Who's Talking. It's going to be all about those criminals. How do we get them into studio? How do we get up close and personal with them? And what have they got to say when the cameras are off? So Cork Opera House, tickets from corkpodcastfestival.ie, 30th of March. See you there. So Colin Sutton, you're so welcome.
It's lovely to be here.
Yeah. How long have we been trying to, I'll take the hit on this, the blame. You're busy. I've been sort of trying to get around to this and since well before the new year, but here we are.
Yeah, we're here now, aren't we?
Yeah. You must be tired, are you?
No, not really. I don't mind driving. I'm doing loads and loads of driving at the moment, and I don't mind that, so that's okay. But doing the shows, I mean, I did a show down in Wales, in South Wales, and it was actually something I was meant to be doing. I do a few with somebody else where he's an ex-cop, but he's a psychologist as well.
Yeah.
And we call it Manhunter and Manhunter, and it goes down really well. And he talks about how, psychology helps investigators, and I then say it's a load of rubbish, and it's quite a good show. But very sadly, his wife's very ill, and he's sort of at her bedside in hospital, so he couldn't do it. So rather than let the audience down, I actually had a new show that I was working on, and I sort of brought it forward and wrote it up quickly and did it last night, and it went down really well. So
you sort of piloted it.
Yeah. They didn't know that at the time until the end when I told them. But it seemed to go down okay. Yeah.
So do you remember your first time standing out onto the stage and wondering, how the hell is this going down and how the hell did I get here?
Yeah, absolutely. And you still get, each time you do a new show for the first night, you get those same feelings then as well, because you're never quite sure how well it's going to land or if you've gauged it right.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I've never been much of a performer through my life, but I guess I spent an awful long time briefing police officers, and standing up in front of them and talking to them. So that never really bothered me too much. And I'm, me, I'm not the most serious of people. I might have done quite a serious job, but everything, a day at work without a laugh is a day wasted. And so I kind of put that into it as well. And I've always been quite comfortable talking to groups of people. I don't know. So yeah, I'm enjoying it. Yeah.
And especially when you kind of realise that, I always think when you look out into an audience and you don't see anybody looking into their phones, it sort of gives you a little bit of confidence, oh God, they're actually interested in what I have to say here. So
yeah, it's interesting to me. The some venues I've done have been really big venues, and I've had big crowd. I've had two crowds of over 700 on individual nights, which is huge. But some venues, the audience are that much further away from you.
Yes,
and you lose that bit of feedback. You lose, you kind of ask yourself, well, did that land? Did they hear that? Did they understand that?
Yeah.
Because you haven't heard the gasp or the titter or whatever you're expecting when you deliver that line. So I quite like the smaller ones. If you get a smallish venue that's actually packed out, it's fantastic. It's a real buzz. Yeah.
So as we said, you're coming to Ireland. You're going to do Dublin, Drogheda and Belfast, and we'll give some details of where those shows are and where they can get tickets for them later and on our social media. But how you actually got to this place. When did you retire, and when did the TV drama Manhunt, starring Martin Clunes, come along?
Right. Well, I retired in 2011, and it wasn't until it was another 8 years before the drama came out. But of course, these things are often quite a long time in the making, and that one particularly was because of a change of personnel at ITV, and it took them a long time to finally green light it. But I guess really it started, and the whole thing started when I just decided that I needed to write it all down, particularly the Levi Bellfield investigation. The team that I had the absolute privilege of leading had done so much good work, and so many people had been so dedicated to it for so long and made sure that we succeeded. And I was of the view at that time, the way true crime was done, everything was very much focused on perpetrators. And nobody really understood what it was like for an investigation team like that, when something had really got under their skin and they really felt motivated to do their very best job with it. And I thought, if I don't write this down, nobody ever will, and it will just all get lost to history. And that was my initial motivation. And so I started writing the book. I had all the sort of doubts I guess anybody who tries to write a book for the first time have. This is just a load of turgid nonsense that nobody's ever going to want to read. And unfortunately, just completely by chance, a friend of a friend of a friend got a screenwriter called Ed Whitmore, who's a fantastic, well-respected screenwriter in the crime drama genre. He wanted to find a recently retired police officer who could help him make something he was writing more authentic. And we got put in touch by this sort of friend of a friend of a friend. And although what he was writing never actually got made, we really hit it off when we had a meeting and we were talking. And I told him about this idea I had for this book. And he said, "Oh, you've got to keep on." And I'd written about a quarter of it, I suppose, at that point. And he took that, "Yeah, it's really good, really good. You need to carry on." And I sort of took him with a pinch of salt. But he was the one that pushed me. If it weren't for Ed, then I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you, I'm sure. He pushed me to keep going with it. He effectively sold it to Buffalo, the production company, who made it for ITV in the end. So, I owe him a huge debt of gratitude. And, I'm really proud. I'm pleased to call him a friend now. And we've worked on other things as well together since then. So that's how it kind of all came about. It was just, I just wanted to make sure that it was recorded and people could read about how bloody good that team was that I had the fortune to lead.
Now, obviously that followed a 3-decade career, I think, in the Metropolitan Police. And the aforementioned Levi Bellfield was pretty much one of your most high-profile captures. Bellfield was the killer of Milly Dowler, amongst others. Tell me a little bit about him and the investigation.
Yeah, well, Levi Bellfield's just, the most evil, horrible, misogynistic person I ever came across. And he would take some beating to find me one that was worse than him. I certainly don't know of one. And he had been attacking women, young adult women, basically if they turned down his advances when he'd try and chat them up out of a car, he'd pull alongside them. And he had the gift of the gab. Could be quite charming. It's surprising how many people said. But I now know, of course, that's one of the sort of warning signs with psychopaths is they can often be very superficially charming, and he certainly was. And he used that to his advantage to try to get women to consensually come and have escapades with him. But what we know is that he was doing this, and if he were rejected in a way which he found triggering or insulting, then he couldn't help himself but respond by lying in wait and attacking those women. And he was doing that, and he'd committed, a number of crimes. He'd committed a murder and an attempted murder, and a number of assaults, serious assaults, where women were really badly injured but survived. But it wasn't until he attacked Amélie Delagrange, a French girl, in August in 2004 in Twickenham, that my team got given that investigation. And that was what kind of opened the door to finding out who he was and what he did. And we had this investigation that went on effectively for 3.5 years before we got it to court.
So what had linked those previous cases you talk about, and how was it ascertained that you were dealing with a serial offender?
They weren't really linked as such, because there was one murder, but the others had all been just assaults where the victim had survived. And although some of them had very bad injuries, the way of the world and the way investigations went and still go is that a different unit investigates murders. There is a dedicated murder squad that deals with murders and obvious attempted murders. But if you survive and it's just a serious assault, then that stays with the local division. And it was just a an accident of geography as to where he was working, that he managed to straddle his offending across 3 police divisions. And so each one of those individual assaults had been investigated on its own, but nobody had really tied it together until we got him as our potential suspect for the Milly Dowler murder, and then started looking back at all these others and realised, I mean, where he was working mostly, it is in the London Borough of Richmond upon Thames, and people, even people from throughout the world know of Twickenham because of Twickenham Rugby, obviously, and the big rugby stadium there. But the whole borough is the safest borough in London. It still is. It's the lowest crime borough of all the 32 boroughs in London. And yet we had this little knot of 7 or 8 murderous attacks on women, all within about an 18-month period. So when you kind of took a step back and looked at it and you realised what was going on, it was, I'd say it was pretty obvious, but it was very stark to see it. But just because of the way that things were organised, it hadn't actually been identified as a pattern, and the connection between them hadn't actually been made.
And because, Colin, those attacks, even though they were in the same sort of borough area, it would be unusual for a kind of an unknown perpetrator to launch a violent attack on a woman, on a random woman. It is the stuff of nightmares for women as such, but it is quite a rarity, isn't it?
Oh, it's very rare. I mean, and that was, that just made it even the more stark, the fact that we had this glut of them in an 18-month period in a relatively small, quiet and safe part of London. Yeah, I mean, when we did the sort of intelligence trawl when Amelie was murdered, we went back about 10 years or a bit more, 15 years maybe, and there was only one outstanding similar murder in the whole of London in that time. These are very, very rare offences. But you say about the scariness of it. I mean, the effect on the local population, particularly the local female population, was absolutely palpable at the time. They were frightened. They were frightened, and it put me in mind of many years ago when I was a student and I was at Leeds University and the Yorkshire Ripper was still working, and the kind of feeling amongst women that I knew then from my fellow students at university in 1980 was just the similar sort of feeling that young women, particularly blonde women, because that's for some reason who he went for. That was the feeling they had around there at the time. It was a palpable fear.
And over the 3.5 years of the investigation, how did you come upon Levi Bellfield as a suspect? And also, I suppose, what was going on in his life that had created this monster?
How we came across him was that it was a kind of a combination of things, really. The thing that he didn't know, he's one of these people who actually took lots of preparations and tried to act and to offend in places where he thought he would be safe. He didn't know that the local bus garage in Twickenham had just equipped all its buses with some really good CCTV cameras that operated both inside and outside the bus. So we had an awful lot of that, and we seized 2,500 hours of CCTV in the first 3 days of the investigation. We had 7 officers viewing it, as opposed to the normal 1 or possibly 2 in most cases. And from that, they managed to find that there was this little white Ford van that was parked by the side of Twickenham Green at exactly the time we knew Amelie had been murdered. And it wasn't there 5 minutes before, and it wasn't there 3 minutes afterwards. So that was something that was obviously, of interest to us that we needed to try and find. And although we had the maker, model and colour of the van, we didn't have the registration number because CCTV didn't show that. And we were doing all sorts of things to try and find out who was using little white vans like that in Twickenham to try and identify the driver. And while we were doing that, we started looking at what we call the single suggestion file. So believe it or not, when you get these outlandish cases that are really high profile, the public generally wants to help, particularly the public in that area. And we'd had no fewer than 129 separate women phone in to our instant room or walk into our mobile police station on Twickenham Green and suggest their partner, husband, boyfriend, former partner, former husband or former boyfriend as being somebody we should look at.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
I know. And well, it is, but it probably just shows you the scale of which, the scale of the suffering that there is through domestic
violence. Yes, yeah.
That even in this quiet, nice part of London, that we still had nearly 130 women come forward and suggest 130 men, and it just so happened that one of those women who'd gone in to the mobile police station to report Levi Bellfield, her former partner, she's reported him to a police officer who was in the mobile police station, and the police officer, just happened to bump into a member of my team and said, "Oh, this woman came in and said something about her partner. What happened?" And he said, "Well, I don't really know, but I'll find out for you." And so when we started to look at this file of these single suggestions, amazingly, we started with that one because this officer had been asked a question. So out of all these 129 men, the first one we looked at was Levi Bellfield, which, I've often said it's better to be lucky than smart doing this, and we sort of got lucky there and we saved a lot of time. And as soon as we looked at him and we found out that he was a wheel clamper and he used a little white van, and then we started looking at his history, and he didn't have a huge number of previous convictions, but he had an awful lot of contact with the police. He was often getting arrested, and often there was intelligence about him, and he was kind of getting into scrapes. And I think it's fair to say that he used this kind of charm that he possessed to talk himself out of trouble with the authorities over the years as well. And indeed, I think he felt that he could still do that right up until he got convicted at the Old Bailey in our trial. But yeah, well, as soon as we started looking more deeply into him, we realised that there was another case. One of these attacks that we were looking at was an attack on an 18-year-old young lady called Kate Sheedy, she wasn't murdered, she survived. She had awful injuries, and she's one of the bravest girls I think I ever came across in my life. And she'd been run over. She'd actually seen him waiting in the vehicle ahead of her, didn't like the look of it, and crossed the road. And because she thwarted his attempts that way, he took umbrage on that and just swung the vehicle around in a big U-turn and ran her over, and caused an awful lot of injury to her spine and to her rib cage, her liver. But say she survived and made a good recovery. But
was that done? That was done in anger then. So he was impulsive.
Yeah, it was just deliberate. It was. I mean, I think the whole thing of these attacks was that they were all done in anger. The anger generally was that I've chatted you up and you've told me to go and whatever myself or whatever because you're not interested. And it's one thing saying no, but if you actually offend me or abusive to me, then you're going to pay for it. And that triggered him. That's what we think. We don't know because he's not admitted any of this, but that's the likely explanation. In this case, the anger was not because she'd told him no, it was because she'd thwarted his plans and he didn't even get a chance to talk to her.
So and that imagined.
Yeah, he just took the U-turn and ran her over. But I mean, the front wheel of this people carrier is a Toyota Previa, a big sort of 7-seat people carrier. And the front wheel went over her chest and abdomen. And then she ended up between the front and the back wheel. Then he reversed over her again. So the actual weight of the vehicle went over her body twice. And she was conscious throughout. I mean, it was just the most dreadful, horrific sort of attack. But when we started looking at his intelligence, he'd been arrested, not charged, but arrested 3 days before that attack, driving this white Toyota Previa. And of course, that was the sort of vehicle that she said had run her over. So very quickly, once we'd identified him, we had him using and driving a white Ford van on the night that Milly Dowler was murdered, and we know that a van was very close to her when she was being murdered. And then we find that when Kate Sheedy had been attacked in the previous May, 3 days before that, he'd been driving a different vehicle, but one identical to the one she said ran her over. So all of a sudden, we've got this man we're looking at, and we've got pretty strong links with him and two of the offences that we're looking at. And then ultimately, we look back at the murder of Marshall McDonnell in Hampton in February 2003, and we went back to the CCTV from the bus there because those buses were in a different garage and they had CCTV earlier. And we saw a Vauxhall Corsa, and we couldn't see the number plate on that. But what we did know was that Bellfield had a silver Vauxhall Corsa at that time as well. So all of a sudden, we've got 3 different vehicles, all driven by this man at that time, turning up at the 2 murders and the attempted murder. So all of a sudden you think, well, we don't like coincidences, as the old saying goes. So, yeah, we started treating him seriously.
And your psychologist would maybe tell you that the vehicle was sort of a weapon, would they? And that, it was some sort of a power thing, that he was behind the wheel and driving this?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, this was the only one that we're aware of where he used the vehicle as a weapon. But I mean, that was what one of my officers said to me. And it was quite amusing because the 3 of us went to have a look at this case of Kate Sheedy, and there was I say this at my old tour I did. It's mildly funny, especially for police officers. But I had 2 detective sergeants and me, and we went to talk to the local police. And one detective sergeant said, "It's definitely our man," and the other one said, "It's definitely not our man." And as I was the senior officer, I reserved the right not to make my mind up, because that's what senior officers do. But part of the persuasion, if you like, to me from members of my team was, if you substitute a Toyota Previa for a Hammer, there's no difference between these attacks. And they were right. He just happened to use a different weapon that was to hand and was convenient for him at that time in the circumstances.
What's your, what do you think happened to Levi Bellfield, or do you think he was born bad?
I always say that's above my my pay grade, Nicola, because
give it a try.
From what we know about his childhood, how he grew up, he had a very strong attachment to his mother. He had a strange relationship with his mother. She would, we would listen to his phone calls from prison, and they would talk about things that even the most people with the most open and confident relationship with their mothers would blanch at, shall we say, intimate things they would talk about. His father died very young, when he was about 8. He was apparently bullied and was not a bit weedy at school, and kind of decided that he was going to sort of solve that problem by working out and bulking up, and he certainly achieved that. So certainly the bulking up bit. But when you look at, is that born evil, or is it nurture or nature? That sort of question. I'm really not sure, because he was the most self-centered, narcissistic person I've ever encountered. I've often said the phrase, "Nothing mattered to Levi except Levi," and so he wouldn't. He just didn't take into account anybody else, so anybody else's feelings or needs or wants or rights, shall we say. And just a really strange, sort of silly story almost. When we arrested him, he was wanted on warrant for failing to appear at the Crown Court in Guildford for dangerous driving. And we thought, well, that sounds a bit severe, going to Crown Court for dangerous driving. And we spoke to Surrey Police, who were dealing with it. And at the time, there had been big roadworks near Heathrow Airport on the M25. So, the M25 is the sort of orbital motorway around London, and they were widening it to 5 lanes, and there was roadworks there forever. And it was a real pain, and there was always traffic congestion there. And this dangerous driving offence, which was captured on video, was actually 4 lanes of stationary traffic on the M25, and him overtaking them in a Golf GTI on the hard shoulder at 77 miles an hour. And you just look at it and you think, wow. And this is, we're people who actually drive on blue lights and things down the hard shoulder sometimes when you have to. You don't do more than about 20 miles an hour, because it's such a dangerous thing, and people can do things and get out of cars and open doors or pull over there. So you go very, very slowly. He was doing 77 miles an hour. Just didn't care. Just they're in my way. I'm going that. So it was that kind of thing, giving, when he was using various stupefying drugs to facilitate rape and abuse of young girls during his life as well. And he started with ketamine and then went on to GHB. And he would give GHB to his friends as a joke to see what it did to them. And some of we recovered a phone that one of his sort of victims, although he'd say she was a girlfriend, but she was only 16 years old and he'd been with her for 2 years. But we recovered a mobile phone he'd given her. He had it in his possession when he was arrested. And there were lots of little video clips on there that he'd taken. It was one of the first phones to be able to do that. And just things like deliberately driving through puddles to soak people. And then he'd also videoed himself talking to motorists whose car he'd clamped. And he was just being, particularly to women, he was just being so overbearing and so threatening and so menacing to them, and so I don't know. It's you.
He's almost sort of hiding in plain sight, and it's the arrogance maybe of him that people take a minute to realise what has just happened in his presence, that he's said something like, or that he's behaved in such a way. He sort of reminds me of somebody actually I'm doing a bit of work on with a similar kind of relationship with a mother and somebody who has a huge amount of driving offences actually. There seems to be an arrogance to that, isn't there? It's that two fingers to the law, to what everybody else has to do. And, you know, when they come together with that certain type of a personality, you know, it's maybe very simplistic to say to somebody, were they born bad or were they? It's a combination of things usually when you find somebody who is, and not that there's too many like Levi Bellfield. He sounds like, thankfully, there's a finite amount of people really like him. I think there's there are other people that display the same traits to a greater or less degree. I think he's unusual in having all of them together. But he also, I mean, he surrounded himself with people he was able to bully as well. All the people who worked for him doing the wheel clamping, they were all people who were in one way or another vulnerable, and he took advantage of that, you know. And he was actually essentially a coward. We spoke to people, he was a doorman in London for a number of years, and we spoke to some of his colleagues there. And they said it was all well and good with Levi. You know, he's a big presence, and he'd be a big man and be there. He said when it actually kicked off, there was a mass fight, as there often happened, at nightclubs. He'd be nowhere to be seen. He'd disappear. He wouldn't. He didn't actually like getting his hands dirty and getting involved in the real dangerous stuff. But he was great at bullying people that he knew he could ride roughshod over. Yeah. Now, Levi Bellfield was one sort of serial offender that you came across in your career. And I'm sure a serial offender as serious and as murderous, as dangerous as he is a rare thing. But you also were working on a case of another very significant serial offender known as the Night Stalker, who you ultimately identified as Delroy Grant, a very sinister character who targeted elderly, vulnerable women and carried out a series of horrific sexual assaults and rapes on them, breaking into their homes, violating everything about them, their safety, their security, everything. Is it unusual to have had two cases as, significant as those within a career? Because I know plenty of police officers and they certainly haven't kind of been involved in or investigated many serial offenders. They will have obviously investigated murderers, mainly domestic violence murders really, but two significant characters like that, or is it the nature of the size of London and the reach of the Met Police?
No, I think it was just just how the cards fell really. A lot of police officers of my rank get trained to be senior investigating officers. Some of those then get further trained to do serial or serious offences. And out of all those that get trained for that, there are actually very few of them who really get the chance to use it and to do it, because there aren't that many. And the fact that I had two of them is just exceptional and just unusual. And I mean, the second one really came about because I was asked, having had the success with Belfield, we had a new commissioner in the Met, Paul Stevenson, who thought there was a vulnerability over this Night Stalker case because it had been going on for 17 years. So, I mean, yes, there was, I suppose. And it was suggested, well, let's get somebody to look at it. Well, Colin was successful on that one. Let's let him have a look at this. And that's how it started, really, was just me to go and have a look and do a sort of a review and see if anything could be done. I think two things then played into that. One is that I had a new line manager who wasn't that keen on me and wanted to, saw it as a good opportunity to shift me across the other side of London. And secondly, I went over and had a look and decided that I thought it could be done a different way and wrote a plan thought that was my job, but of course I got the gig, didn't I? Because that's how the world works. So that's how the second one came about, and it was quite tough because I had to go across to a part of London in which I'd never worked, with people with whom I'd never worked, and the person that I was replacing was well known and well loved in that part of the world, and had put an awful lot of effort and a lot of years and a lot of his career into trying to solve this case. And it's always difficult when you're going to pick over somebody else's work, isn't it? And trying to change things. But I guess there was, some of my friends, my old team from the Belfield team said, "You're mad. You shouldn't do it." You should say, "No, I'm not doing it. You can retire soon. You don't need a blot on your copybook. That thing can't be solved."
You didn't need an unsolved when you had it solved.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But it will just be a blot on your copybook. You won't be remembered as the man who led the team that took down Levi Bellfield. You'll be remembered as another man who went over and failed on the Night Stalker. And there was a little bit of me that was a little bit combative about that and thought, I can bloody show you, maybe, But there was, I think, more the feeling for me was, well, actually, there's a lot of people failed over a number of years with this case. So actually, there's no shame in it if I fail as well, is there? Because it's obviously tough. It's obviously difficult. And it was. But yeah, it was one of those things we got lucky. It's interesting. I talk about this.
Well, you kind of went back to old school policing, didn't you, to try and...
Yeah, I ended up writing a book about this one as well. And there's a whole chapter in there that I called the DNA seduction. And I think that was the right word to use, because the fact was that this offender had been leaving DNA at his offences. He actually understood how it worked and thought, as long as they don't know who I am, then they're going to have problems. I can leave as much DNA as I want. So not only was he committing rapes and leaving DNA, but he dropped a pair of gloves, or one of his gloves at one, and there was DNA inside that. He drank out of tins of beer or cartons of orange juice in the scene and left his DNA on the container. He didn't care about leaving his DNA because he knew that it was really difficult for us to deal with it and to find him just through that. He was absolutely fastidious about not leaving his fingerprints because he knew that we had his fingerprints on file and that would have sunk him. So he made sure never to do that, but he didn't really bother too much about the DNA. And the thing was that when the series started, so the first offence was 92, but they didn't get DNA from the samples until 96. Then the series started with the next offence in 98. That was about sort of 3 or 4 years into DNA being the new big thing in policing and in prosecutions and in detection. And there was a feeling, I think, that we've got his DNA. This new wonder thing is going to solve all our problems, and we will. And so everything, I wrote it in the margin of my big red notebook when I went to the first meeting when I was doing this review. Everything that the supervisors on that team, so there's about a dozen people there talking about it, and every single thing they talked about was the DNA. And they were trying to be really clever. They'd gone to universities and said, can you, if we give you this DNA sample profile from this scene, can you tell us what he looked like? And of course, universities would say, yeah, we can do that. Oh, it'll cost you, but we can have a go at that. And they see it as an opportunity to further science and to make some money. So they say, yes, we can do it. And of course, it didn't work and it wasn't any good. But everything was predicated on the fact, well, we've got DNA. That's how we're going to have to solve it. Mm-hmm. And so because if there's anything I'd say I'm necessarily good at, it's making sure that my team have the best ability to do their job to the best of they can, and making the conditions right for that. I think that was the most important part of my job. But from a personal point of view, it is that I can sort of think laterally sometimes. And my lateral thinking on this was, well, if they're talking all about the DNA, they're so focused on that. What if we didn't have it? What if we didn't have that DNA? What would we be doing then? And that led me down to thinking, well, actually, this man is a burglar. He just burgles all the time. He then often will commit indecent assaults or rapes afterwards. But essentially, each offence starts with a burglary. How do we catch burglars? Well, quite often we'll do that by doing surveillance where we think they're going to strike, because most burglars are quite parochial. Mm-hmm. And then the problem is that this man's area was a quarter of London, and you can't really lock that down. So you have to use crime pattern analysis and try and be a bit cute as to where you do it and see where it gives you your best chance. And that's what we did. And I got as much help as I could from people who knew about surveillance and various other, all parts of the Met came together. and provided me mostly with people, with officers. We had 80 people nearly on this surveillance operation. And 17 days after we put it into action, he turned up in the area we were watching and committed an offence, and he was arrested, and that was it. So we got lucky. It worked that way. Rather than chasing him around trying to investigate it as an investigation post-offence.
Or waiting until his DNA was somehow captured through some other offence he did and matching them up. I think the one thing that got me with that story, and your book is called The Night Stalker, yeah?
Yeah, Manhunt the Night Stalker.
Yeah. Because I know I got fleeced for it, didn't I? And you signed it for me.
That's 44 pence I made out of that. Then each one gives me 44 pence.
That'll make you rich. Anyway, no, but I read it. I felt, for me, that story is so, it was the horrors of the victims, the elderly women and their stories. And I mean, I would have found that personally very difficult to investigate. And of course, as a senior investigating officer, you're not just sitting in an office directing people what to do, thinking, how to approach this. You're also meeting the victims, aren't you? And and you probably have to do that to get your head really into these crimes and how significant they are. But I think their stories would stay with me.
Yeah, I mean, it was a bit of a change for me because, of course, for the previous 9 years nearly, virtually all the victims I saw were dead. But I spent an awful lot of time too long talking to recently bereaved people, which is just as stressful, really, and just as heartbreaking.
Yeah.
But the one, people do ask me quite often, Nicola, they sort of say, "Oh God, how do you put yourself in the same room as someone like Levi Bellfield and Delroy Grant and not lose your cool?" And that's just, that's actually the easy part of it. The easy part of it is knowing that you're there to do a job and do it professionally, and you just, any more than if you work in a department store and someone's rude to you, you don't smack them around the head, do you? Generally, you're doing a job, and you have to represent that organisation and that job and be a professional face on. But there was one time, and I you'll remember the chapter from the book. There's a woman that I called Ellen who was in the book, and I used that name because it was my late grandmother's name, and she was of the same generation and the same attitude, really. And she was 94 years old. She was the oldest victim. And I went down there because when I heard how frail and how old she was, Night Stalker never killed anyone there and then or immediately afterwards. But I was very aware that because of the profile, because of the age and the infirmity of his victims, that was always a possibility. And so when I heard this woman was very frail and 94, I said, look, I'm going to come down because I want to make sure we do everything properly here so that if she does take a turn for the worse, we've got it all and we've started a murder investigation effectively. So I went down there, and she'd been speaking to the family liaison officers, and I had two family liaison officers who were just so dedicated and so amazing, both women, with all these victims. And she'd been talking to them, and then I turned up, and they introduced me and said, Ellen, this is Mr. Sutton. He's the boss. And she sort of said, she had a lovely voice. She was quite a very middle-class old lady. And she said, "Oh, Mr. Sutton, hello." And I said, do call me Colin, And she extended her hand as if she wanted to shake my hand. So I grabbed hold of her hand, and it was very thin and cold, you can imagine. And she pulled it down towards herself, and she couldn't pull me, she weighed about as much as one of my legs. But I went with it because she obviously wanted me. And I thought she was just going to sort of shake my hand. And then she put her other hand on top of mine and pulled me further. And I'm right down face to face with her now. And she just whispered in my ear, "Colin, he interfered with me, And that was the first disclosure that she'd made, that she'd been indecently assaulted. She hadn't told the family liaison officers. And I wanted to cry, and I wanted to find this man and strangle him there and then. And that was it's not only the only time in that case, that was the only time I think in my whole service where I really felt, God, if that guy had been in the room there, I'd have lost it, because it was just this lovely, old, dignified woman reduced to that. And of course, then you get the next decision I have to make is, because if she's alleging that, the protocols say she should then go to a rape suite and be examined and swabbed and have this. And I always say this, that there is no way of of squaring this circle. But if you are raped, if God forbid, someone is raped, they go through the most traumatic experience of their entire life. And then within 24 hours, we put them through another traumatic experience. And we have to do that because you cannot prosecute that allegation of rape unless you've got that medical evidence. But it doesn't matter how pink the walls are and how sweet and soft the music is and how many flowers are on the table and how soft the furnishings are in the suite and how sympathetic and well-trained the officers are, and I hope they are now. At the end of the day, you've still got to go there in a room with a doctor and have things inserted and things swabs done and it's just a nightmare, but there is no way around it. So with that particular case, I've got this 94-year-old, very frail lady who said that to me, and I'm just thinking, is it going to make any difference overall? We need to find this man. We don't need to actually to charge him with whatever he's done to this lady because we've got his DNA from rapes going back that are going to put him in prison forever. So why should I put her through that? Because that's just going to heap more misery and more suffering onto her when she's already suffered enough. And it just occurred to me, I thought, oh, sod it, it's my call. I'm going to say no. So I told the others, I said, no, we're not taking it to the rape. She said, well, we've got to take it to, she's made the allegation. I said, no, we're not doing it. It's my call. I'll justify it. I'll write my policy decision up about it. And if something hits the fan later, then it's down to me. It's my decision. But I'm not going to put that lady through that examination. There's no point. We don't need to. And she died 6 weeks later. She virtually stopped eating.
So, Colin, was he caught then while she was still alive?
No, she died her offence, I think, was in June, and she died sometime in August, and he was caught in November.
Right.
Yeah. But it was a no hope. I spoke to her daughter. Her daughter was abroad, and financially she was a single parent. I think she couldn't get back here, so she didn't see her mum before she died. But I spoke to her on the phone, and I was able to say to her, "Look, he's killed your mum just as surely as if he'd shot her or stabbed her. It's just taken a little bit longer, but there is no way." The causation, we can't prove that it was him and what he did that caused it. We know it did, and you know it did, and I'm sure it did.
And I suppose you knew one way or another she died a different person than the way she had lived up until that point at 94.
Yeah.
He could have broken her spirit or whatever it is that kept her going at that age.
Absolutely. I mean, I think her husband had quite a good job in insurance in the City of London, and they were quite well off. It was a lovely house. I mean, it was a bit run down because she probably didn't have the money to have things done to it. But it was a lovely house, and they'd obviously been, had a nice lifestyle. And he'd been dead for 25 years, and she'd lived there on her own for 25 years. And she had sort of mobility problems. She did crocheting, and she crocheted herself this enormous blanket. And she told me about it, and she's got this rocking chair, and it's just, the front door went into the living room. It was sort of open plan, the bottom of this big house. And she had a radio there, and she used to listen to Radio 4 and sit in this rocking chair. And she said, some nights, if my hips are feeling bad and I just can't face going up the stairs, I just pull my crochet blanket over myself and just sit here and sleep in the rocking chair. And that's what she'd done on the night that she was attacked. She was in a rocking chair at the bottom of the stairs. It was just heartbreaking.
Yeah, the image of that is...
It really, really was. But yeah.
Tell me, and we, or at least I know you're very popular with the public because I ended up being your personal assistant stroke photographer for a particular night when you were being asked for pictures with...
Was that a crime con?
Yeah.
But you got your own back because the hangover's only just subsided, actually.
But what I was going to ask you, so you're popular with the public. People are coming along to your shows, the length and breadth of the UK, and as I said, you're coming to Ireland. What do the public want to know from you? Like, do you let them in a way lead the show, or do you present? Do you tell a story? Do you open up to the public? Do you allow them ask questions from the audience, or how do you rock?
Yeah, I tell a story, if you like, and I talk in this show. I talk about four different crimes. Okay, and the first half are two murders that I was involved in investigating that are not very well known, but they're both a very different type of investigation, and it's really me trying to show the breadth of different things that we have to do. And one of them's quite old, and it gives me a chance to go back a little bit in time and talk a little bit about the old days and how things were, and how they've changed, I suppose. And it's, in some ways, the first half, although it's talking about two murders, and people say to me afterwards, I didn't expect to laugh so much at a murder show, which I like, because it's meant to be entertaining. That's the idea. It's not a criminology lecture. You know, I can do that and do that. I can do training days for police officers. But it's not what it's about. It's in a theatre. It's for members of the public who are interested in true crime, but they want to come out, I think, and be entertained, and I try and do that. So the first half is that, and then the second half, I talk about Bellfield and Grant, but I talk about aspects of the cases that aren't that well known. If you're a huge fan, you've watched all my TV programs and read both my books and taken them in and digested them, then you'll probably know a bit about the things I'm going to talk about, but not everything. But most people that come only know the headlines about Grant and Bellfield and the things they've convicted for. And I talk about other things that are involved in both those cases. And by the time we get to the end, it's really serious. And in fact, somebody at one of the theatres the other day said, I really liked your soliloquy at the end. I thought, God, that's a word I've not heard since I did English Lit, at school. But yeah, by the end, it's quite serious. But that's deliberate. It sort of starts off when people are laughing. It's some of it is genuinely funny, I hope, and tell the stories, and then by the time we get to the end, it's back to where perhaps people thought it would be. So, and I think it works, and the tendencies are gradually sort of creeping up, actually, I think, as word gets round. So it's going very well. I'm very happy with how it's going. I don't do questions in the traditional sense of giving a radio mic to the audience, simply because various people, the promoters and people at theatres, have warned me against that, on the basis that it only takes one person to hog the mic and ask ridiculous things, and you sport it for everyone.
That's
but it. Which is, and there was an idea of getting people to text questions to me at half time, and I'd answer them, but that seems a bit clunky and a bit unnecessary.
But I think you're generous with your time, and people who approach you, you will stand and talk to them, maybe to your detriment.
Yeah, every single gig, I say this at the start of the second half, every single show I say, at the end, I will be out in the foyer somewhere. There's a big banner from the promoters. I'll stand by that, and I'll stand there until the last person goes home. Yeah. And much to the annoyance of some of the theatre staff sometimes. But I've had 150 people queuing up to ask questions, to take photos, to get me to sign. I don't sell anything, but they bring books along, or they want me to sign their ticket or something like that. And I don't mind. I mean, in some ways, that's the best part for me, because it's nice to meet people. I love meeting people. And, if they've been good enough to spend their money on my books and watch the programs on TV, then I'm good enough to spend 5 minutes talking to them. I mean, I think that's just fair. So, yeah, I'll do that. And I'll do that in Dublin, in Drogheda and in Belfast. I
was going to say, cheesy question, but are you looking forward to coming to Ireland? You have to say yes, obviously.
No, I really am. I'll tell you what. And I may have told you this when we've been talking before, but I've been to the Republic a number of times over the years, probably 5 or 6 times. Most recently, I was in Tipperary because we had to go and do some filming for the last TV series. It's a murder that took place in London, but there were Irish people who were living in London, and the family have all moved back, and they said, yeah, well, we're happy to take part in your programme, but you'll have to come and see us. So that was marvellous. So we went over there for that. I've had friends and girlfriends indeed from the Republic, so I've been over there quite a bit. I have never been to Belfast. I've never been to the 6 counties. So that was,
you'll love it.
I'm sure I will. Everyone tells me I will.
You will.
And just as a lovely little sort of thing I'm looking forward to when I do Belfast, Joe Brunt, who was effectively my sort of number 2 and my great crutch that I leant on, and Gary Cunningham, who did the interviewing for Bellfield most of the time, they're actually doing a job at the moment, and they need to be in Belfast in April, so they're going to coincide it, and they're going to come along to my gig as well. So
fantastic.
Nice to see them as well. Yeah.
Well, I'll certainly be coming to at least Dublin.
Oh, good. I'm
not.
glad. I'll be disappointed if you want.
Belfast might. Anyway, so look, thanks for coming on. Tickets for those venues. Now, I will put something up on our social media about where you can get them, but one way of directing you to the venues is your website, Making of a Murderer 2.
Yeah.
www.makingofamurderer2.
Just Google Making of a Murderer 2. Yeah, just Google it.
And all the dates are there, including also, I mean, you're going to be working away in the UK before and after that. So for the moment, let's leave it at that. And I haven't forgotten what I was assigned to look into. I just haven't quite got around to that yet, and I will. I'm on it.
We're busy, Nicola, both of us. I understand that completely.
You get it.
As long as you got it done by April, I don't mind.
We will get around to it. I mean, everything gets done eventually, but, you just sort of look at the calendar at some point and you have a complete freak out and you realise, oh my God, I'm nearly up to my deadline here on this. So I'll get there. But look, Colin...
I told you, I've been to the Republic many times. I know everything gets done eventually.
Eventually, yeah, exactly. The story of our lives. Well, look, thanks so much for coming on and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Yeah, see you soon. Cheers. Thanks.
Thanks, Colin.
Robbie Lawler was out of control.
This is Double Cross, the murder of Robbie Lawler.
It was going to be an all-out war with him in the middle of it.
A Crime World special investigation podcast based on my new book, Web of Betrayal, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.